Okay, welcome back to USC ITP 115, Programming in Python. Today we're going to be talking about files and specifically writing to files. This video is part 2. It's made to follow reading files. So if you haven't watched the reading files video, please do go and watch that one first before this one. So in the last video, we used this same idea of talking about Python as a middleman between a file in with data and then a file out with data. We can read data from files, manipulate it, actually read data in from many different files and composite and aggregate it, and then output it in a report. That's fairly popular. We talked about text and binary files and how we're going to be dealing with text files because they're easier to work with and cross-platform. The same way that we would need a connection to read from a file in Python, we also need a way of having a connection to our file system for writing to a file. So the 3-step process for writing to a file is use the open command, the open function, to open a file for writing, write the data to the file, and finally close, because every time we open, we want to close. The way to do that in Python, same as reading, except for one small change. We're still going to use the open command, the open function. We're still going to specify a file to write to. And then now for mode, we're going to use W instead of R. W for write mode instead of read mode. And then if we do that, open will return, we'll get back a file object, a variable of type file object, which is a way of Python's way of representing a file variable. So it's a Python variable representing a file in our file system. And so the really cool thing about Python is the way to print to a text file is the same way we would print to our console, to our output, to our standard out, the way that we've just been printing all semester, but with the addition of an optional parameter. So just like we have the optional parameters of a separator character and an end character, right? And these all have default values. Remember, the default separator value is space. The default end character value is new line. And the default file value is standard out or terminal. So meaning if you don't specify file, it's going to just go to your terminal, your output, right? When we print something out, it goes to the console, the standard output at bottom of our pie chart, our program. But you can also override that. Just like we can override the separator character to be nothing and get quotes around our Mad Libs, we can override the end character to be nothing and get all of our output on one line. We can override the end character to be carrots and get carrots at the end of our, or 2 new lines. We can also override the default value of the file parameter to be whatever file object that we got back from our open command. So open is going to give us, right, a file object back. So we give in our file name with a mode of W, get back a file object. That file object is what we pass. So as we override the default value of the optional file parameter to the print function with that file object. Let's look at an example. Before we look at an example, remember, anytime we open a file for reading or writing, we always want to close it when we're done reading or writing. Okay, so here's the example. We start with our open function. We pass in the file that we want to write to, and we tell Python that we want to write to this file with the file access parameter of, in this case, with a value of W for writing, file access mode W for write. So we want to write to words.text Python, and Python says, okay, from now on, you can access it through a variable called fout, right? So we want to be able to, here's a variable, we named it fout. We're storing the return of the open function in fout. This is just creating a variable year, giving it an int value, 1991. And so here we are going to do our first file write, and we're going to do that with the print function, right? So hello world, just like we always would. We could also do separator and end if we wanted to, but let's just focus on writing to a file. So let's now override the default value of file with what we got back from open. So f out, which stands for file output, is what we named our variable, or we named our variable of type file object that was returned to us from the open function, the open command, which is words.txt. So you can think of f out as a way of writing to words.txt. And the way that we do that in Python is we tell Python to print to the file f out. Okay, so file name is a parameter to open. Open is going to return to us a variable that we label either f out if we're in writing mode or f in if we're in reading mode. Then this file, this variable of type file object or file object variable, is what gets passed as the value to the file parameter of the print function. And once we do that, once we set up that scaffolding, we can print whatever we want to the file, including, in this case, hard-coded strings. We can also mix in variables of various types, including strings and numbers, ints and floats and other strings, right? We're using comma here. So print is doing the automatic typecasting for us. And we are also, in this case, going to a file. So these two, right, this line and this line are going to go to a file called words.txt. And we can mix these with normal print commands. So in this one, we're not specifying a file. It's going to go to the default file, which is our output, our console, our terminal. And so it's going to say done. And so this is a good example because it's showing that on some of these print statements, we can go to our file. On other of these print statements, we can go to our text output. And notice that the way we do that is the same. Whether or not we specify end or separator characters or commas or spaces or not, that we can mix strings and numbers together. Just by adding on this extra little file parameter, they can now go to text files. So in the last video, we learned about R for reading from files. In this video, we're learning about W for writing to files. One important, and there are actually more than this. There's like R plus and W plus and A plus. The ones that we're going to use in this class are R and W, namely. But one thing to keep in mind when you use W is if the file that you specify with file name already exists on your system, then its contents will be overwritten, replaced. Okay, so if the file doesn't exist, it will be created. If the file does exist and there's data in it and you use mode W, then it will be overwritten, replaced. So you actually could theoretically lose data. A safer way of writing to a file is to append to it instead of blank overwrite to it. And you can do that with A, mode equals A, or mode of A, for append. And that's nice because just like before, if the file isn't there, it will be created. But if the file is there and had data that you wanted to save, it will be, the new data will be added on to the end of it and nothing will be overwritten or clobbered or replaced. So let's look at another example. Let's open up words.txt in append mode, right? Instead of W mode, stored in a Python variable of type file object named f out. Update our optional file parameter to the print function with f out. Write Python is fun to the file. Finally, close the file. Anytime we do an open, we need to close, right? We don't want to leave open doors. And then we'll get whatever we already had in our file that was already there in words.txt. And then now on this open and close, on this we call file writing session, right? Open and close pairs of session. Now we are adding to it Python is fun. So this is a way of preserving what was already in the file. So suppose we suppose we wanted to write a program to write info to a text file, loop to allow the user to enter data, right? So The really cool thing about this is you can actually look back on any of your old labs and assignments and look at any of the programs that we've previously written where you prompt the user for input using the input command. And now, instead of or in addition to writing whatever you were writing to console, you can now just add a optional parameter to print called file, point it to a file object that you opened with the open command. And now instead of or in addition to writing all your output to output, you can also now write it to a file. Okay, and we'll go over way more examples in lecture. See you then.